there, today I'm talking about 3 adaptations of John LeCarre novels, all of which were set in the 60s and 70s. Even though the films themselves were made between the 60s and the 2000s. The first ones were made as the novels were written, and then the latter one I'm going to talk about was made much later. But they all take place in the 60s and 70s. They're all looking at the Cold War during its peak and what's actually going on in the Cold War. As you've been told that this is kind of like the realistic view of the Cold War. Now, John LeCarre actually said that even compared to the actual Cold War, these are almost romantic fictions compared to what some of the stuff that actually went on, because it was a much more incompetent thing than even he got away with in these stories. So even though this was a more realistic take on it, there's still some romanticism involved. There was still some conventions that he followed. So even though they take place in this world of spies and espionage and are pretty cynical of the world, there is a romanticism to them that probably didn't exist in the reality. So you have to kind of accept that they are spy movies, they're not realism. So that's the kind of disclaimer. But the film I'm going to talk about are The Deadly Affair, The Spy Who Came In From the Cold, and Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy. So I'm going to do them in that order. Now, The Spy Who Came In From the Cold was the first one that was made. Deadly Affair was made a year or two later, but they share the same screenwriter. And then Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy, the film adaptation, was made in 2010. There was an Alec Guinness adaptation on the BBC in the late 70s, early 80s. There was also Smiley's People. I'm not covering them today in this video. I've seen them, I really like them, but it's been years since I've watched them, so I couldn't really comment on them beyond the fact that they're very excellent. So I'm just going to talk about these 3 films, but I'm going to talk about them in order of how the books were written, because it is a kind of interesting place to be to watch these films. So the first one was directed by Sidney Lumet. The second one was directed by Martin Ritt, and the third one was Thomas Alfredson. So 3 different directors, 3 different paths. The first 2 are American directors on a British subject, and they actually managed to adhere to the British subject really well. Even though there is a kind of bigger budget feel to them than BBC production would have, because they are films. They are meant to be big films. There is a big difference between what American thinks is realism and what a Brit or a European thinks is realism. 2 different things. So there is a bit of romanticism in especially The Spy Who Came In From the Cold. The Deadly Affair, which is based on a novel called A Call for the Dead, is actually a bit, even though there's a kind of romanticism to that one as well, it's a bit darker. So even though it's Spy Who Came In From the Cold is in black and white and this one's in colour, it feels pretty dark, the Deadly Affair. It's the underrated one of the 3. It's the one you're probably least likely to have seen. But it's available in Indicator in the UK, so it's definitely worth seeing because it is a very good film. So I'll start with that one, Deadly Affair, A Call for the Dead, because it's basically the first novel that introduced George Smiley. And George Smiley goes through all these stories. He's a kind of central character in the early part of the career of John LeCarre. Because John LeCarre was a spy. John LeCarre is basically his author name. It's not his real name. Because he was actually a spy when he was writing these books for the first time. The first 2 books I'm going to talk about, the first 2 books that the films are based on were both written while he was still a spy. The third one was written well after he'd left. But he was one of those. Apparently, there was 2 things went against him. One, there was leaks of spy names from inside the British intelligence, and he was one of the ones who was named, so he couldn't be a spy anymore. But also, he'd started making a living as a writer, so he could follow this up rather than trying to work for the British intelligence. So he managed to take what he knew and then actually see how his experience of the spy world in the 50s and 60s was a good metaphor for Britain post-war and British what Britain was, and then how that evolved in the world over time. So he did come from this very sort of conservative, ruling the nation type of mentality, stiff upper lip, a lot of repression, a lot of people who couldn't say what they really were, a lot of people who fell to the side, you know. It was just a lot of like repression in the area. It was like it was a generation that was conceived and grew at maturity before the 60s. So they weren't flower power people, they weren't like 70s people who were more cynical. These were like the original like post-war babies who were, they probably believed in the flag a lot more, at least early on, before the reality came in, and the fact that the British Empire was failing and, you know, was less of a power than it ever been in the past. So they were dealing with disillusionment, they were dealing with the idea that they were like the second to the Americans. Basically, the Americans were the main power against the Russians, and they were like a side island that was important to America, but was not the most important thing to America. And there was lots of other allies for America against the Russians that were, you know, also important. They had to deal with. So it was a world that had changed. That Britain had gone from being a country that ruled and had a lot of power politically in all these different governments to being a place with embassies who could advise and who could say they give the point but might not be taken up because these places now had their own way of doing things. And they were also in countries that, dealing in countries with embassies where they weren't particularly welcome. So it was a very different time. So you had all these spies, and not all the spies were looked upon as being the top people. You know, they were taking what they could get. There's a lot of people who were taken from like the top level of universities, and some of them had been actually infiltrated by communist propaganda, and some of them were actually secret communists. But the whole point of these stories actually is that neither side's particularly great. Like, you don't want either side really to get to really win. I mean, you didn't want the communists to win because the communists were totalitarians, they were authoritarians. They ruled at people around first, they were horrible, and they wanted a certain way that just doesn't really jive in the West. But the West was shown as corrupt, feeble, failing, miserable, depressed. It was not a great place either. It was a place of depression, and if you dealt with America was all gung-ho about how great they were, but they were also dealing with Vietnam and stuff. So, I mean, every place was compromised, and Americans were obviously paranoid about the Russian threat throughout the 50s, 60s, and 70s, and were doing horrible things, even when we got to the 80s in like South America. So, I mean, America was also pretty, you know, insane. So there's a bunch of insane countries dealing with each other during the Cold War. And that was the kind of milieu that LeCarre wrote about, but he wrote about it from the point of view of the British Secret Service. That was his area. So The Deadly Affair is based on his first novel, Call for the Dead, and it introduces George Smiley, who's played by James Mason. Now, he's not called George Smiley in this adaptation because the rights to the character were for Paramount because of he appeared briefly in The Spy Who Went from the Cold. It would take a while before the rights reverted back and they could use the name George Smiley again. But he's got a different name, doesn't really matter, because if you watch the film, you know he's George Smiley. So you can mentally just change it over every time they mention his name, which is rare. They establish his name once or twice, and then everybody knows he's really George Smiley. So they don't push it too much. So Paul Dane, who wrote this one, also wrote Spy Who Went from the Cold. He also wrote some Planet of the Apes sequels and a bunch of other stuff. And he worked with this one, Sidney Lumet. He also worked with Murder on Orient Express much later with Sidney Lumet before he died. He died fairly early. And he was viewed as LeCarre as a very good adapter of his work. And, you know, A Deadly Affair is actually, it's probably the clunkiest of the three films, but it's also the most interesting of the three films in lots of ways. it's a story basically of a guy who comes in who is some points of thinking about him saying he had a communist past. Smiley's sent to talk to him. He says there's not. He assures them that there's nothing to it. That this was just a smear thing. Don't worry about it. And the guy goes away, and Smiley goes back to his office. And then it turns out the next morning they find out that the guy committed suicide. And Smiley, because this guy was a prominent member of the cabinet and a member of the spy service, that's a controversy. So Smiley is sent to go and find out what happened, because he's the one who's in the dock for it, because he's the one who said everything's fine and then the guy died. And it's more or less he has to find out, okay, what actually happened? Why did he commit suicide? Or was it a murder? And of course, it was a murder. You know, that's not a surprise. It was a murder. But it's about who murdered them and why, and what the past was for all these people. And it goes back to the concentration camps. Because LeCarre was very good at talking about the different cultures that came through the war and into the different services over time. There was a lot of people with with Jewish past in his books. There was a lot of dealing with concentration camps and the Nazis, because a lot of the spy stuff takes place in Germany. It's now been split in half between East and West, and there's a lot of reminders of the war through that. So LeCarre brought that up a lot. So it's basically the wife of the guy who died was in a concentration camp for years, and she met the guy, and he took her out of there. And there's some suspicions on her, but no one's quite sure because she seems a bit crazy. She's played by Simone Signoret, the French actress, who's older than she was when she was at her peak in the 50s at Clouseau. And they make her up to look really old and haggard. You've also Maximilian Schell coming in as a guy who worked with Smiley during the war. You've Harry Anderson from the Bergman films as Smiley's wife, who's cheating on him. And that's a big thing that goes through a lot of the books with Smiley, is his wife cheats on him, and he has learned to deal with it. And this film actually goes into that relationship a lot more than the rest of the books do, because it's a push and pull between them. Because he recognises this as an aspect of her personality that he can't control, really. It's almost like an addiction. He doesn't want to judge her for her addictions. He has to live with it. And it's the anger that comes from that, and the depression. And James Mason was always great dealing with women and playing characters who are dealing with these women who had difficulties and were difficult people. He was always great at that in any film. So he was in his element in this film. So he's the angriest Smiley by a mile. He's the Smiley before Smiley learned to put keep everything below the surface. That's a Smiley still showing anger. That's a Smiley, who could still get angry, make mistakes, and he wasn't quite formed yet as a character that would go through the rest of the stories. Which makes him really interesting. It's a real shame that's the only version of Smiley you got with James Mason, because there's something there that was very different from Alec Guinness or Gary Oldman playing a character that is fascinating. Plus, Sidney Lumet's the director, and this is one of his most interesting films where, he's dealing with pulp. Because, despite all the realism involved, this is still a pulpy story of, trying to figure out the past, and spy novels are inherently pulp. This is not Bond pulp, though. This is closer to reality, but it's still romanticism involved, and there's still conventions involved. But it is quite inventive, all the different things they do, and try to figure out who's the spy and who's the mastermind behind it all. You can probably figure it out as characters introduced. There's a few characters introduced. You probably figure out he's too big a name to just be in this for no reason. There is that element, but it doesn't matter ultimately because it's a well-told story. The characters are interesting, so even if you're ahead of it a little bit at times, how you're getting from A to B to C is always interesting, and it's all about spy work, about how people pass information. You don't do pass information in the Bond way, where it's really in the middle of something huge. like some show-offy thing. No, this is a people, you know, in the back streets of London, finding little ways to pass information along and stuff like that. So it's very seedy. You have Roy Kinnear showing up as this really dodgy guy who gets beaten up a lot. Then Smiley breaks his hand at one point because he gets attacked. There's lots of stuff and stuff. We have Harry Andrews showing up as this detective who the spies trust. He's a retired detective who helps Smiley in the investigation. And he leads some of the investigation for a while when Smiley gets injured. And she's an interesting character because he's just interested in facts. He likes animals, he likes facts. He doesn't care about Smiley's try to work out the bigger plan. He just wants the A to B to C of it all, and he's much more interested in that. So there's all these characters that show up, but it's always about betrayal. It's all about personal betrayal, and because this the spy business is, you know, everybody you're betraying ultimately, and everybody has a price, and it's always a lot more personal to let on. And this film really gets that. This film really is about that sense of, like, it's actually a small community, you know, small community name than I've ever liked to admit. And there's a lot of the ties between people are personal because they fought in the war, they fight in the war together. They've dealt with people through different situations over time. So it's a long-term relationship between lots of people who, some of whom may be lying. So it's a wonderful film. It's very underrated, and I can't recommend it enough. Now we have The Spy Who Came from the Cold, which is the big adaptation. I mean, Deadly Affair was a smaller film. It was shot in colour. Sidney Lumet is a director who is budgeting up and down, but he was never like, he was a big director critically, but he was never always the biggest director commercially, having massive budgets. But his films got a lot of respect, and he made some great films over time. But he also made some trash too. So it's like his career was all over the place. This one was Martin Ritt's film. He'd just come off some big films, and so he got a chance to make this one. So he made it in black and white, even though he could have done it in colour. And it starred Richard Burton and Claire Bloom, and it was a big budget Hollywood film, and it's terrific. It's really terrific. John LeCarre said it's a good film, but he didn't like the film noir aspects of it. He thought they were a bit overdone, and some of the sets were a bit stagey, which is true about the sets. Some of the sets look too big for what they are, for what they're trying to be, and that's what pulls you out a lot more than anything in the Lumet film. The Lumet film never. You can tell some things are sets, but they feel kind of right for the world they're showing. This film, sometimes the sets in Russia feel a bit too big for the story they're telling. But the story's terrific. I mean, you do feel this is a film you do feel could have been 10 minutes longer. There's a couple of things in the middle you feel could have been expanded a little bit more, and you'd have got more from it. But the story is, it starts with Richard Burton, and he's this burnt out spy whose agent had just been blown as he tries to cross the border and he gets killed. So Burton's burnt out, and his control in London pulls him back and says, "Okay, that's you're done. We'll give you an office job, you know, but you're kind of done. You've done your time. It's time for you to retire from field work or from being in charge, something like that. It's time to just take a backstage job and stuff like that." Burton doesn't want to retire. He still thinks he's got one more mission left. So Control pulls him into this scam, basically, where they're trying to make Burton look like a defector. So they have him leave the service, be unemployed for a bit, go to jail for attacking somebody, and essentially it's about him being contacted by the Russians quietly and surely, and going up the chain of different intermediaries for the communists as he tries to sell his information to them. But of course he's really a double agent. he's telling him stuff that he knows isn't going to cause any real problems. It's all legit, but stuff the Russians might know happens anyway, because both sides have a fair idea of a lot of each other's operations. It's about what's the operation behind that operation that's the real issue. And essentially, they're trying to turn the second in command to try and kill the person in command of the Russian intelligence, because the guy in command is too good, basically. So, plus he was an ex-Nazi, and now he's working for the Russians. Well, the second command is Jewish, so he's got a bone to pick with this guy. So basically, Button crosses over into eastern Germany and starts getting briefed by the second command, and it's basically about him turning the second command to try and kill the guy in charge. Of course, that's not really what's going on. I won't say what's really going on. If you haven't seen it, you should really watch it. It's wonderful. What's really going on is much more complicated, but you know that even early on, this, from what you've been told and what you're seeing going on, there might be more to it. So, because I mean, basically what I'm telling you, the plot is essentially stuff that you find it fairly early on. So it's not really, I'm not going to tell you what more is going on, but there are some wonderful moments. There's wonderful scenes of interrogation, and there's a lot of talk, people in rooms talking to each other. You have Richard Burton as a burnt out guy Richard Burton can play burnt out any day. He's so good at it. Probably because he was a very troubled figure. So he's perfect for this part. And everybody around him is terrific. I mean, they're all kind of, the guy they're trying to get is this blonde guy who looks very German and pissable. The guy they're trying to turn has some honour to him, so he believes in his cause, and you actually do feel something for him, because him and Butler are both soldiers in a fight where they're not at the top, but they do have a lot of similarities. So there's lots of stories there. You've got the romance Burton has with Claire Bloom as well, which is terrific. And the mood of it all, really, the black and white really helps, the sense of doom. I mean, I don't quite get I get why LeCarre says it was a bit too film noir for him, because he was looking at the reality of the situation. But as a viewer, it really works. It really sells you the idea internally of, this is all going to go wrong. Button is getting played. And you get that from this off. Even as soon as you're told this plan early on, you know there's something else going on. And it's just watching it all unfold. So Smiley's in as played by Liam McKern. He's a secondary character who's part of the plot, but he's secondary. But it is like a wonderful version of the character. There's a lot more outgoing, a lot more easy to deal with. He's not angry like the James Mason version. He's not as quiet as the Gary Oldman or Alan Guinness older version. So it's an interesting to see Smiley. You also get Control, who you also see in later versions as a more older man, but here he's at his peak and he's like a spy master who's playing his different games. So it's a very satisfying story. You may take a lot of time to get into it, because the first 20 minutes or 30 minutes is setting up stuff up, setting up everything about the disillusionment. So the actual plotting, the typical spy movie elements don't kick in straight away. They start in the beginning, and then you go off to the character stuff for 20 minutes, and then they start to build back up. So just a little warning, that is what happens. And if you're a Hammer fan, Michael Ripper pops up in a small part later in the film. So that's always nice to see. So it's definitely a terrific film, definitely worth seeing. I'm trying not to say too much, because I know it's a film that's well known, but not everyone's seen it. And you kind of want to not know everything. Now, Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy was made much later. It was made 2010, and it was based on the novel, the most famous LeCarre novel, Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy, which is all about the what I mentioned earlier with the upper class British spies who were the top level of the service, and there was some traitors there. And of course, LeCarre was very angry with these people. He did not like. He'd been basically pointed out by one of them, so that could have been dangerous for him. But luckily, he was okay. So he obviously had a bone to pick with these people who had all the best of the British service and turned their back on it. So this is a story about a Russian spy within the British Secret Service, and them trying to figure out who it is and why it's happening, why these things are happening, why cases are getting blown. And it's a much more complicated story than you can actually talk about, because it's really complicated. I mean, they made I think it was a 6-part or 7-part adaptation by the BBC. I needed all of that to get all the story in and all the nuances in. In this version, it's compressed, but you still get the basic story. It's a terrific film, because they actually realise the best way to tell the story is to stick to Smiley investigating it, and not spin off in other directions, and just be him and his team doing the investigation, and the information comes into him, and let that be the focus of the story. So it's about Smiley ultimately, and his interactions with people, and whatever it means to him ultimately, so that all the other plots that he's investigating all come through him. So that it works really well. Also, it really helps that Gabriel Woodman is terrific Smiley, as the older Smiley. The Smiley who's been around a lot. He's now very quiet. When we watch at the beginning of the film, he's like number 2 to Control, who's still in power, played by John Hart this time. He's past his peak. He's old and tired, and everyone thinks he's paranoid. And they're now dealing with Carre, who's now the new head of the Soviets spy system, and they're dealing with him and the duels with him now, and it's much more complicated trying to work out how to deal with him, because he is a master spy as well, and he's an ideologue, and he believes in his cause. So ultimately it's Smiley trying to deal with Carre and try to work out what Carla's doing to figure out all the rest of it. So early on, Control thinks that there's somebody in their circle, in their main circle, because it's called the Circus, is the main British intelligence office, and they think someone in the main circle, or there's like 5 or 6 of them in this small office that's soundproofed, that how they get all the information, who basically deal with the British spy service stuff. And he thinks one of them's a spy for the Russians. Everyone thinks he's paranoid. He sends someone in a case that turns out to be a trap. So the situation's blown, and Control and Smiley are sent packing. Well, Control sent packing, he pulls Smiley out as well at the same time. Months later, there's other things happen to make the politicians in charge think that Control may have been right. So they pull in Smiley, because he was away when other things went down, to actually investigate the possibility of a mole. So Smiley has to bring in his own people, which is Peter Gwilym, played by Benedict Cumberbatch, who's a minor character in these novels, who's like Smiley's like confidant. He's a younger guy. And there's Mellon, who was played by Harry Andrews in the Deadly Affair years ago, and it's still the same character. This played by Roger Lloyd Park. Basically a cop who Smiley relies on. Smiley knows he's trustworthy from the past. So it's quite funny to see the characters re-emerge in other contexts. In this case, Gilliam is actually is a gay character. In the actual novel, he's not. He's heterosexual with his wife and family. So it plays differently. But they're just trying to take it to the idea that there's a lot of gay people in the service, that it was just part of life there. And people kept it private because it was illegal at the time. Britain had a lot of things they lived with even though it wasn't legal, they just figured a way around. And it's all about how everyone has secrets, everyone has things they're dealing with that they don't want to bring into the office. So it's just a case of trying to work out, okay, what's relevant and what's just someone's private life that doesn't really matter. And it's also about what's relevant and the information they're getting through. Because someone's relevant, someone's not. And obviously Carle's trying to confuse them all the time. And Smiley knows that his ex, the people he used to work with in the circus, they can't know he's investigating them. And they're not trustworthy, and he knows their flaws as people, and he's trying to work out what's a flaw, what's something he does not admire in them, and what's actual treason. Because there's a big difference. Like, someone's treasonous, but he doesn't know who it is. He has to work it out, and as you go through, you realise that the person who's the traitor has been warned by Carle that Smiley will be onto him. So he has to take precautions. So it's a game where both sides are pretty smart and they're trying to do things, but they're also human and they make mistakes. Every side makes a mistake that could wreck them. And even some of those mistakes they make have hidden meanings. So it's a very complicated plot. Again, I will not even try to explain it all here. But if you haven't seen it, go watch it, because it is wonderful. You can watch the film, you can watch the TV show, they're both terrific. The plot's terrific. It's complicated but also simple, because it always comes back to the characters. So each character actually has their reasons. Each character has their doubts and their flaws, and people make mistakes, and it spends enough time on each character, and there's a lot of smaller characters played by like character actors like Kathy Burke and Stephen Graham that pop up and have their story told, or their part of the story within the main narrative told. You have Tom Hardy popping up as a spy who's been thought of as some of the things a traitor, and then he tells me his story, which is more complicated. And it's all about like how can you survive as a spy within this situation it's got multiple realities and multiple deceptions within deceptions, and it's also murky that no one can make heads or tail of it apart from Smiley. Even that's after a lot of work. So this is the most complicated film in lots of ways, and it is wonderful though. I mean, it lacks the passion of something like The Deadly Affair, which actually has a more brutal Smiley, a more interesting Smiley. This one, Gary Oldman's, is more of a cipher. He's working it out, you're getting a lot of information quietly from him. It's just a wonderful performance. It's just a very different performance from James Mason gave. Leo McKern was based in it for 20 minutes and Spike went from the cold, so it was less of a Smiley that you could get grips to. But all three films have this weird interest, and there's a sense of romanticism to it as a world slowly ending and moving on to a different type of world that the people involved in this world can't figure out. They're getting replaced by new ways of thinking and new political ideas that they are not quite up to. They can't quite turn their heads to. So they're getting replaced, and the world's changing, and they're in this old way of working the world, a lot of which is horrific, a lot of which is dingy, deceitful, lying, horrible characters people who have lived too long, have been bruised for too long, who are vengeful and nasty in lots of ways. There's also people who are tragic because there's a lot of decent. If someone's decent in these tales, there's a good chance they're going to be treated horribly. You know, innocence doesn't get treated well in these stories. You know, so Smiley, even though Smiley's your kind of contact character, he's not always the nicest person. He does things that are kind of horrible at times. So these are wonderful stories. They're probably the best you can do, taking into effect the actual reality of spy work with a kind of more classical narrative that you need to keep people interested in the story, because if you're just doing the narrative of all spies are incompetent, it's hard to do that. It's hard to do a story that way. It's satisfying. So they have to infuse this sense of depression and guilt and moral collapse within a narrative that works. So LeCarre's very good at that. And then as he moved on from the Cold War, he managed to move on the way his character couldn't into what's going on in the world now, what's happening with the British culture now. So he moved on, but his spies couldn't move on. So I hope you enjoyed this video. All the films I've talked about are definitely worth seeing. They're all very good films. So I'll see you later. Bye for now.